I'm Dean Newland, and welcome to the Business of Intuition, where I coach, facilitate, train, and speak on the hard science and meaningful experience of intuitive leadership in business, so you can make better decisions, forge real connections, and creatively solve problems to amplify your impact and simplify your life. Welcome to the Business of Intuition. In today's fast-paced and ever-changing business landscape, leaders grapple with the challenges of adapting to a hybrid work environment and training their employees in essential leadership skills. The rapid evolution of workplace cultures adds another layer of complexity to their responsibilities. However, the unfortunate reality is that only 5% of organizations invest in leadership development, overlooking the tremendous potential for growth and success within their people. This lack of investment poses a significant problem as leaders need help managing their teams and navigating their businesses amid the dynamic environment that we just described. Recognizing the crucial importance of investing in leadership development, I was fortunate enough to speak to Vanessa Judelman, and we discussed the need for self-awareness, style agility, and leadership development for leaders to manage their teams and businesses successfully. By embracing these principles, leaders can empower themselves and their team members, foster effective communication, navigate conflict, prevent burnout, and prioritize tasks strategically. Additionally, we shared valuable resources like a couple of books, for example, Thinking in Bets and Who, Not How, to enhance decision-making skills even further and identify the right people to accomplish goals. Organizations can unlock the full potential of their people and thrive in the ever-evolving business world by embracing leadership development as a non-negotiable requirement. Vanessa Judelman is the president of Mosaic People Development, and for 20 years or more, Vanessa has been helping clients to develop leaders who inspire great results. She is a speaker, she is a facilitator, she is a leadership consultant, and a certified executive coach. Having worked, quote unquote, in the trenches herself as a leader, she teaches her clients a very practical approach to leadership that she has used to develop her own high-performing teams. Over the years, she has also trained and coached thousands of people to transform from doers to leaders. She works with leaders to give them the tools and strategies they need to feel confident, be more self-aware, be team-focused, and be strategic. She has also authored the book, Mastering Leadership, What It Takes to Lead in Today's Fast-Paced Environment and World. Vanessa Judelman on the Business of Intuition. Well, Vanessa, it's great to have you on the show. And I thought I would maybe lead us into a conversation by putting some recent history into people's minds that before COVID, it seemed like we had a pretty strong economy. Things were chugging along pretty well. I'm not saying that everybody felt that way, but a lot of companies did. COVID hit us all in the teeth, and we all had to go virtual. And lockdown was very painful across the planet. Then we came back out of COVID, and this whole idea about, do we have people come to work? Do we have them stay at home to work? That whole conversation. Then another trend seemed to come across our radar screen, which was the Great Resignation. People saying, you know what? I think I'm going to take that $25,000 signing bonus and go somewhere else. Loyalty be damned. I'm going to go wherever the grass is supposedly greener. Where are we at now? What's your sense regarding people with respect to the talent market? And then also, what's your sense on the current opportunities and challenges with respect to leadership?
Well, based on the series of events you just described, Dean, I personally think this is the most challenging time for leaders that I've ever seen. I've been developing leaders for over 20 years, and it's really challenging right now for leaders for many reasons. The environment is changing so much. Workplace cultures are changing so much. Hybrid work, we haven't done this hybrid workplace, we haven't done this before. And so leaders are now responsible not only for getting their work done, building high performing teams, all coaching and developing people, all the things that they had to do in the past, they're responsible for figuring out hybrid workplaces as well. And it's a challenging time for leaders in general.
So are leaders today, is their job description just got bigger? Meaning like what you just indicated, now you got to figure out how to lead people in this hybrid work environment, which is an unknown commodity, an unknown skill for most of us, if not all of us. And then this other thought, I guess I'm sort of sensing what you're saying, is that we have people who are coming into their job interviews and they may not be fully able to be leaders. They may not have the skills or the competencies or the experience. Do you think that now current leaders in companies, not only on one hand have to deal with this whole hybrid thing, but now they have to train people just to get them to par, just to get them to work well within a team and to have the emotional intelligence and all the other things that makes, businesses move forward successfully, where maybe 2 years, 5 years, 8 years ago, that was just a given. That was just something we expected. Now, are we still expecting that? Or are we now realizing we have to train for that?
Oh, yeah, 100% we have to train for that. The problem is, Dean, most organizations do not train for it, but the organizations that do, they're outperforming their competition. Organizations, for example, that are teaching leaders, how do I build high trust teams? How do I build trust up, down, cross inside the organization, are outperforming their competition by almost 300%. So the organizations, and I read somewhere recently, Dean, that only about 5% of organizations actually invest in their people and invest in leadership development. So those are the organizations that are going to rise to the top, whether they're small firms. I mean, I work with clients that have 50 people in their organization up to, 50,000 people. So if anyone is thinking about, do I invest in my leaders or not invest in my leaders, invest, because it will really differentiate you from your competition.
I totally believe that. Of course, you're speaking to the choir, one choir to another. And I wonder, what is the communication barrier? What is it that we as leaders or trainers of leaders are not communicating with respect to the ROI of training people to become leaders? Because it seems like, in my estimation, and I'm curious what you're thinking, that we sometimes put leadership development on this nice to have but not need to have list. When things are good, when we have a nice ROI with a variety of other things, when the company is doing well, yeah, we'll invest in leadership development, we'll do some team building, and it almost gets relegated into a perk versus a necessity. Do you agree? And if so, how do we bridge the gap between leadership development and the perception that it is directly related to the bottom line and the top line of organization?
I'll tell you why leadership development is a necessity, not a perk. Let me explain the history. First of all, I want to say that I never call leadership development soft skills. That is one of my big pet peeves, Dean. Whenever someone refers to it as soft skills, I say, what's soft about it? These are hardcore business skills. If you as a leader, for example, don't know how to develop your people, you're at a loss. If you don't know how to have crucial conversations with people, you're never going to get to a high-performing team. So that's one thing. Don't ever refer to them as soft skills. That's really my pet peeve. So let's talk about these core leadership skills. So here's what happens. I've been developing leaders. I've seen develop leaders over the last 20 years who are brand new to leadership, who are executives. Some executives that I work with have never had formal leadership training. And so what happens is they come to me as an executive coach because somebody in the HR department says, you know what, Vanessa, this person is really strong technically, but is having a lot of interpersonal issues. They don't understand their work style. They don't know how to give feedback to people. They're not motivating. They're a nitpicker. I could go on and on at the list of what I call bad bosses, right? And so the problem is when I meet these people, they're lovely. These are lovely, smart, well-meaning people, but they lack self-awareness, right? So if you don't understand, for example, what your work style is, you don't understand that everyone has strengths and weaknesses. That's normal. But you have to understand what your strengths are. You have to understand what your weaknesses are. You have to learn what behavior, I call it dialing up or dialing down, right? Mm-hmm. You have to learn what behavior to dial up or dial down. And some people can do that intuitively and some people can't. They have to learn. For example, a lot of leaders that I work with are very direct, right? And for all of us, our strengths, when we overuse them, become a weakness. If you don't know that, you might be overly direct, right? Like, I think being direct is terrific. It's a great quality to have, but don't overuse it, because then you could become too direct and you may come across as rude, for example. So having self-awareness, knowing how to lead your team and manage your business is so core. And when leaders don't have those skills, interpersonal issues erupt, their confidence is really low. One of the biggest things that I see with leaders who go through some kind of development is their confidence increases. And they say, you know what, Vanessa, now I know how to do it. And now I know that I'm doing this right. And that's huge for people in terms of their ability to lead properly and lead with confidence.
I'm thinking about the practicality of this in some ways, that there are people that might be listening to this and say, Vanessa, sounds great. I'd love it. And I have so much on my plate as it is already. What you're sort of suggesting is for me to spend time outside of what is considered my day-to-day job description to develop my people, unless, of course, the organization supports that. And then you've got, where does the responsibility of developing people lie? Is it with the leader within the team, or is it training and development departments or HR departments, or a combination of both? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, you're responsible for your own career, right? So if you have an HR department and there's somebody who is, has an objective of developing leaders, lucky you. But not all leaders are that lucky, right? So you're responsible for your own career. So find a leadership course, find a leadership coach. The onus is on you to take responsibility for your own career. That's my personal opinion. I don't know how you feel about that.
No, I 100% agree. I think it's probably it takes a village kind of thing. It takes yourself, it takes your own leader, it takes other organizational structures and support to be able to really do this, because it becomes a microcosm of a larger culture. What do we really believe in? Are we here to develop our people because we think it's the right thing to do, because it's going to help our society, or not? So I think it's the individual, the team becomes a microcosm for the organization. You mentioned some things like self-awareness and style agility as being some really important skill sets that leaders need to have. If you were designing a series of classes or courses that had to do with that leader being brought into an organization who really just didn't have the skills, they may have had the right resume, but they really didn't know how to lead people, what would some of those classes be called, aside from self-awareness and style agility? What other foundational skills do we need people to have in order to be successful as a leader?
So when I started Mosaic People Development almost 12 years ago, I asked myself the same question. And what I did is I took out literally all of my files from all of the executive coaching clients that I'd had. I looked at what goals we worked on. I worked in a consulting company for 10 years. I'd done thousands of needs analysis. I took out all the needs analysis and I took sticky papers. And on each sticky paper, I wrote notes. What are leaders struggling with, regardless of their industry? And based on that, I've sorted out the notes into 3 pillars, what I call the 3 pillars of leadership success. So as a leader, the first pillar is know yourself. That's self-awareness. The second pillar is manage your team. And the third is lead your business. So when I run this training program for leaders, know yourself is, we start with a DISC profile, a self-assessment, understand your strengths and weaknesses. We look at trust. How do you build high trust relationships? We look at mindset. If you don't have, I don't know if you know Carol Dweck's work on fixed and growth mindset, Dean, but if anyone's listening hasn't read her book, Mindset, The New Psychology of Success, it's a must read because it's a game changer for leaders to have a growth mindset. Then we move into that second pillar of manage your team. That you have to know how to coach people. You have to know how to build a high performing team. You have to know how to give feedback and have crucial conversations. And then in the third pillar, lead your business, you have to know how to lead and manage and communicate change. You have to know how to execute strategically. You have to know how to, delegate and prioritize. And that piece on executing strategically, as you know, is so important. But most leaders say to me, Vanessa, I know I need to be strategic, but I actually don't know what that means. So we break down strategy into 3 parts. So that's what I call the 3 pillars of leadership success. And as you can see, leadership's complex. But by breaking it down into those 3 pillars, it takes the complexity of leadership and really breaks it down for people.
Yeah, you sounds very much, you remind me of like Jim Collins' book, Good to Great. He sort of breaks that down into similar sort of categories. And I think you may even have one that goes beyond leading the business, which would be leading a movement. How are you going to change your industry? And what does that look like? And what sort of skills are necessary at that sort of level? Great stuff. I really absolutely agree with everything you're saying on that, it's hard to lead a team when you don't know how to lead an individual. It's hard to lead an individual if you don't even know who yourself are and you haven't even got your own personal life, your own business life in order. So it's a never-ending growth process, but it's sort of, it needs to start with self, right? It needs to start with me and you, and then we grow from there. I remember once Vanessa being at some workshop, and I remember it because the person who was leading it said something that is sort of stuck with me. He said, look at your bookshelves right now. And most of the books are around leadership. You and I are in that same space, right? I've got probably 4 different books that I just got from Amazon. And I don't know. I think I must be making Bezos very, very wealthy because I'm buying stuff all the time. But it's a lot having to do with leadership. The interesting thing is, though, that there is not a whole lot on the concept of followership. In order to be a leader, there need to be followers. And so what are the characteristics of good followership? But maybe that could be spun into, how do we be a member of a team, and what does that set of competency skills really look like? And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. Since we're sort of dealing with the leader, you can lead all you want, but if nobody follows you, you're still not doing too well, right? So what does that look like on that side of the fence?
That's so true. Dean, I'm laughing at your comments because I was on the subway in Toronto one day going downtown, and I was sitting there reading a leadership book. And I bumped into a friend of mine. She said, "Why is the leadership called consultant reading a book on leadership?" So I can resonate with you. I've got a bookshelf filled with leadership books.
Yeah.
It's because it's what we love to do. We're passionate about it, right? So followership. That's an interesting question because I don't think followership looks the same for every leader. And the reason is because leaders look very different. And so part of what I do when I work with leaders is I help them identify their own leadership brand. If you want to develop followership from people, you have to do it in your own unique and authentic way. So for example, if you're someone who's higher in the introversion scale, you're not going to develop followership by sitting at your desk, if that's your tendency. In fact, I remember coaching a CEO years ago who is absolutely brilliant. He's an actuary scientist. He runs a very large organization and it's constantly growing. And he said to me, "Vanessa, as an introvert, I really struggle with gaining followership because I'm not the kind of leader that walks the hallways and says hello and high fives to people." He said, "That's so inauthentic. If I did that, I would feel inauthentic and people would know it wasn't natural." And he said, "I just can't do that." So the conversation I had with him is, okay, so what's your goal here around followership? He's like, "I just want to connect with people." And so the conversation we had was, what is that going to look like for you being someone who's high on the introversion scale? And what we came up with, the strategy we came up with was he wanted to book coffee meetings with some key people. So once a week, he would invite small groups of 4 or 5 to have coffee with him. And that was his way of connecting and building a relationship that felt so authentic. And he still does it to this day, 5 or 6 years later. So followership really is about understanding your own personal style and developing that. That's one of the pieces, at least.
I think that's right on. And I'm going back to what you said earlier, Vanessa, that had to do with if you're trying to develop into a leader, say, for example, it's important for that individual to be accountable to make that happen. Not to wait for the leader of your team or the organization to hand these opportunities to you on a golden platter, but to take accountability and to learn and be a self-learner. I think that's so true. And I think that there's something about that is the components of being a good team member, call it a follower if you want, that I have certain responsibilities to my colleagues, my peers, and so forth about being a team player, and versus I'm going to sit back and be passive and let the leader decide how we're going to move forward or how we're going to communicate and so forth. I have a role to play in that. And I don't know whether we directly hit that pin on the head. I think we sort of talk around it. We discuss it, but I don't know whether there's like really specifically enough sort of discussion around what does it mean to be a follower or a team member versus it's almost like if you take initiative now, we've called you a leader now just because you take initiative. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be a leader just because you take initiative, right? It just means that you're making something happen. So I don't know. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I love the book, The Leadership Pipeline, because what the leadership pipeline talks about are the levels of leadership, right? A lot of people don't know there's actually different levels of leadership. The first level of leadership is self-leadership.
Right.
The second level is when you manage someone or passage. They're called passages, not levels. The second passage is when you manage another person for the first time. The third passage is when you manage other managers, et cetera, all the way up to being an enterprise leader, right? So that first level of leadership is self-leadership. It's about really being good at your job, being a subject matter expert. It's about being a team player. It's about being accountable. When someone asks you to do something, you do it. You know, you keep your commitments. You're highly respectful. So that and just because you're not a people leader doesn't mean you can't demonstrate leadership skills within any role in an organization. In fact, one of my favorite leaders is the receptionist at one of my clients. I mean, she doesn't have any direct reports, but boy, does she demonstrate leadership in her role. She is so accountable, so responsible, great at building relationships, really highly trustworthy, highly reliable, takes a ton of initiative. So that would just be an example of someone who demonstrates so much leadership. She doesn't have direct reports.
It doesn't really matter the semantics. I just find it fascinating that I think in our Western culture, we revere leadership probably because of our roots and our independence from England and all the other stuff that seems to be baked into our cultural DNA. Leadership is one of those, you know, it's on the double helix somewhere, right? It's part of our American psyche. And I think that, the way you just described that receptionist, we could certainly call that leadership, or you could also say, well, you know what, that's also just being a great employee. That's being a great team member, right? To have that same sort of set. It's just a sort of a fascinating thing. Like I was thinking about different cultures, if you go to where the collective is more important than the individual, certain Asian countries or so, for example, where that's the emphasis. And so then I think when you go from, a United States or Western North American perspective on leadership, go to a different country where the collective is the primary characteristic that we focus on versus the individual, then all of a sudden leadership has a different definition, and it has a different way to develop it. I'm not saying one is read better or another. I think our leadership's perspectives are a reflection of our cultural norms and the kind of the cultural DNA of what it is to be American or North American, for example. One of those situations that our buddies over at Turnkey Podcast will edit out because the phone was ringing and I didn't realize it. So anyway, back to this idea of leadership and teamwork. I read this book once by a guy named John Katzenbach, who was a Harvard business professor and wrote some books. One of them was called The Wisdom of Teams. And he said that in another book that he wrote called Teams at the Top, that the hardest team to create is the executive team because they've been so indoctrinated and rewarded and patted on the back for being leaders, taking control, all those characteristics you just described with your assistant or the secretary and so forth. All of them are great. But now all of a sudden, when they had to work together as a team, they didn't know how to do it. They are sloppy or there's all this friction, like who's going to take control and who's not and so forth, because they're out of practice with being a team member. So I'm wondering, what your thoughts on that is. Do we need to sort of in our leadership development need to also sort of add what it means to be a member of a team, not just what it means to lead one.
Oh, that's huge. Absolutely. Leaders, because any leader who has a high performing team, it's not a chance that that team is high performing. That leader has put building blocks in place to build a high performing team. I mean, the best model that most of us are aware of is the stages of team development: forming, storming, norming, and high performing, right? When a team comes together, one of the things that I do when I work with new leaders is I give them a checklist. When your team's in forming, here's what you need to do, right? Have you welcomed the new person on the team? Have you shared with everybody the vision, mission, and values of the team? Do you have rules in place? I call them rules. They're more like operating principles around how we communicate with each other. How do you like to communicate? Text versus email? What time do we meet? Is it once a week, every morning at 9? Do you need to be on time? Is 9:05 okay? So what are the rules of engagement? Storming. People don't know that the next stage is storming, where if you don't manage the conflict, and storming's normal. It's normal that you may have some issues you need to deal with as you're building a high performing team. But as a leader, if you don't deal with those issues, whether they're conflict around roles or responsibilities or interpersonal conflict, you're never going to get to norming and high performing. So what leaders tend to do is they tend to just avoid the conflict, hope it's going to go away. But the reality is you're never going to get to norming and high performing, right? And norming is when you work through those conflicts and you get to high performing. Even when you get to high performing teams can burn out really easily.
Yes.
What happens when a team's high performing? People give them more work to do.
Exactly.
And so as a leader of a high performing team, you've really got to watch for things like burnout.
So to say a little bit more about that, you're onto something that I wanted to follow. I've sometimes noticed that those leaders that do well have the potential red flag showing up that says, be careful because you are now a known producer. You're getting work done. Let's just give you more to do. What can that particular leader who's at that stage in their career where they're no longer proving themselves, we got people calling them up and say, hey, could you take on this project? Do you want to take over this department? And so forth. How do they navigate that without looking like it's a career limiting no, to the point where they can stay focused on what their highest and best is without burning out?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question because many leaders don't know how to do that, and they think it's going to be career limiting to say no. So a couple of things I would share with leaders in that position. One is, I love the expression yes and. So somebody approaches me and says, I'd love you to transform this new piece of technology for me. Yes, and I have 6 objectives that are going to take me through to the end of September. So let's look at what we can do between September and December timeframe. What do you think about that? So you're contracting with the person. So I love using yes and. The other piece I would say is roll it up. You may have to go to your boss and say, listen, I've got these 5 priorities. Your colleague on the executive team has asked me to add on these 2 priorities. So now these are 7. I need you to prioritize for me. Do you want me to stick with these 5 that we originally agreed to? Or does one of these 5 fall off? And is this other new one or these new 2 priorities more of a priority for the business? Because their boss may have a lens, just a more strategic lens to some of the business priorities. So I also encourage people to do that. And then the third thing is look at your business goals. Ask yourself, like one of the things that leaders do in terms of lack of prioritizations, they don't know what their goals are. They don't know how, they don't set goals, and they don't align their goals with business objectives. So you, again, roll up your priorities to business goals and objectives. So those are 3 strategies that I would typically share with leaders in that situation.
That's great. And what about this idea about accountability? I think a lot of organizations struggle with that. They're on the flip side, you're thinking about, if I say no, however I say it, there could be career limiting, whether that's true or not. But on the company side, or those who are sort of running the show, they are maybe afraid to hold people accountable because we don't want people to leave. We don't want to lose them, or we don't want a lawsuit on our hands, or, there's all sorts, or, unfair, termination charges and so forth, So how do we wrangle with this whole thing around, hey, you know what? We all have a job to do. We have certain metrics to meet because that's what we're here to do, right? That's the contract for whatever reason. Yet we also know that accountability is our ability to be able to point out when you are and when you're not maybe meeting expectations. That's where I think that there's this chasm where really people struggle with that because it starts looking like conflict. Do you have any tips on that?
Yeah, for sure. So accountability to me is part of coaching, actually. People don't realize that there's two types of coaching. There's formal and informal coaching, right? So informal coaching is sort of the day-to-day coaching that you have with people. It's brief check-ins and problem solving. And you could do a little coaching on a text message when someone has a problem and you're helping them to think it through and solve the problem with them. The formal coaching are scheduled meetings. They're documented. They should be very priorities focused and strategic, right? And when I work with leaders, I actually teach them how to have an accountability meeting, what the agenda looks like. For example, set goals with people. Say to them, let's spend 5 minutes. What are your goals for this week? Okay, then talk about action. What action steps do you need to take to move your goals forward? Help would be the third section. What help do you need from me? And then the fourth section is around information. Here's information that I need to share with you around what's happening in the business. So many leaders have said to me over the years, Vanessa, this is one of the most helpful things that you gave me that's so practical in this training program. You told me how to have an accountability coaching meeting because I've been told to coach. I've been told I need to hold people accountable, but I've never known actually what the nuts and bolts are of running an accountability meeting.
Yeah. And I think that accountability has become a very long 4-letter word. It's not just 4 letters, but it's many more because it's something that people are so afraid of these days. And I think that we do a lot of 360s with organizations. And our goal around that is hopefully to start an internal movement around better feedback. Because when you really get down to it, nobody is going to be perfect and we all have blind spots. And so if we see feedback as a gift versus a slap on the wrist, and we give it with that intention, I'm here to help develop you and to see your highest and best and to support that, then it's a gift. It's like a Starbucks gift card, right? Thank you for the feedback. I really need it versus, oh gosh, I'm being called into my boss's office and I'm going to have an accountability session. I must have screwed up somehow. So now we have this trigger in our system that says every time somebody says they want to talk about something or talk about, have a coaching session, for example, we get all this, stimulus in our bloodstream that says, uh-oh, must be bad news, so now we create this whole story that accountability is bad when it actually could be seen as, we could frame it as a gift. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah. And people don't know what is accountable. What is accountability? It's asking people what their goals are and then asking them how they're going to move their goals forward. And then as a leader, following up with them. Hey, last week you said you were going to do this and this. How did it go? What worked? What didn't? And following up without judgment, right? Oh, that didn't work. Interesting. Tell me, right? Then you put on your coaching hat. Like what's the reason that didn't work? What did you struggle with? What can I do to help you overcome that? Right? So coaching is such a big part, and asking those sort of open-ended, powerful questions is without judgment, just with full-on curiosity, is such an important part of holding people accountable. So accountability, I don't know, people find it really complex. It's not that complex. It's right. What are people's goals and what do they do to move them forward?
I love the way you simplify it. I think sometimes we make things complicated in order to avoid them. And therefore, if we make it simple, then we can take action on them. So maybe we avoid the fear or the tough conversation that we think it's going to happen because we make it too complicated. It's not that hard.
It's not that complicated.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant thought. A while back, I remember we were having a set of interviews with a group of executives, and then we were trying to figure out the culture, and then we asked a bunch of questions of the people that were just below that particular group of executives. And I came back to the executives and I said, you're going to get a little bit of a challenge. And they go, why? He said, because nobody wants your jobs. Your bench, think about succession planning. Nobody really wants to jump into your roles. Now, they might tell you because it's the right thing to do because they don't want to be in a career limiting conversation with you. But what it looks like from their perspective. Leadership looks like a lot of stress, not enough time with family, a certain amount of fear, chaos, confusion, no real process. And thank you very much. I don't want to be a leader, right? Because the energy just doesn't look like fun for whatever reason. And I'm seeing that sometimes. I'm seeing that people are giving off these perceptions of what leader feels like, what it means to be a leader. So what can leaders do that would make the role of leader seem more fun, more inviting, more like what somebody else would want to do, aside from the fact that you get a better pay and maybe the executive washroom key,
And there's no executive washroom key when you work from home.
No, hell no.
It's a shared washroom with your kids. That's
exactly.
Then what are your perks? For sure. Yeah. It's interesting because I've always said to leaders, you set the tone. You set the tone. So part of knowing yourself, that first pillar of leadership success is being conscious of the tone that you set. And when leaders don't have self-awareness, they're not conscious of their tone. They don't realize that they're running around like a chicken with their head cut off, and they're causing so much stress for everybody else in the organization.
Yeah.
But if you're a conscious leader, right, you go, oh, good, I'm going to show up very consciously to work every day by knowing the tone that I want to set. And I often invite leaders to choose, like 2 or 3 words that describe the tone that you want to set. You don't need to share them with anybody, but know what they are for yourself. And again, these 3 words are as different as every leadership style. People could say, the tone that I want to set is open, collaborative, and engaging. And other leaders want to set a tone that is structured, empathetic, and innovative. I mean, so many different words, but pick words. I've never known a leader to pick a word that sounds like, the tone I want to set, Vanessa, is stressful, anxiety-ridden, and,
Good point.
intense. Like, that's nobody's intention to set the tone. So leaders have to be more conscious of the tone they want to set and be more intentional about it.
That's absolutely brilliant. I love that. And so we are testing out and playing with some technology that measures the individual's engagement level in an experience. It's from a guy named Paul J. Zak. He wrote a bunch of papers and has studied this, the neuroscience of engagement for years. And they've got a new website called Best Tuesdays Ever. And essentially you wear like a Fitbit or an Apple Watch, right? And it measures a variety of things about your heart rate and all sorts of stuff that essentially can determine whether or not you have psychological safety in the situation that you're in right now, and also whether or not you're engaged in it. So we're beginning to play. In fact, I've got it on right now. So I'm going to be able to go back and listen and watch the data from our conversation, Vanessa, and find out where I was engaged in our conversation and where I may have checked out, which hopefully I never did, but it will show that, right? So the point is that really strong leaders, back to your idea around setting the tone, if they have that sort of intentionality, can literally bring up the serotonin levels of other people. Because we find that the research that we were connecting into was that we get into a homeostasis with serotonin levels. The individuals sort of like get their serotonin levels to match pretty quickly. And so you're either being brought down by somebody else or you're being brought back up, right? Because we're all sort of always trying to find homeostasis with other people. So strong leaders, really good leaders, can actually create a serotonin level spike and keep it up there for a long period of time based on that very thing you just said, which is setting the tone.
Oh, that's so interesting. I love when the research sort of backs, things that I've been sharing with leaders for 20 years.
Yeah, check it out. The guy, Paul J. Zak, wrote a book called Immersion. And then their website, that their newest version of this app and this technology just came out. It's called Best Tuesday Ever. .com. And I think you'll find it interesting, especially with the work that you're all about. So, Vanessa, tell us how we can follow you, connect with you, learn more about what you're about.
For sure. So my business is called Mosaic People Development. So you're welcome to Google me. I do have a blog that I write once a week. And if you want to sign up for the blog, some people call it really inspirational. It's very fact-based, informative. I also have a great resource URL that people can go to, which is yourleadershipresources.com. And I put together a bunch of leadership resources that are all free, and you're welcome to find me there, as well as on LinkedIn. So feel free to connect on LinkedIn. I always love to connect with people on that platform as well.
But did you write a book or two?
I have written a book.
Talk us about that. Tell us about that. Yeah.
Sure. You'll find it on yourleadershipresources.com. It's called Mastering Leadership, What It Takes to Lead in Today's Fast-Paced World. And in the book, what I do is I break down the 3 pillars of leadership success. Know yourself, manage your team, lead your business. I have 3 assessments based on each of those pillars. You can self-assess yourself, see what you're doing well, see what your gaps are. And there's some tangible strategies you can leverage to really develop yourself, your team, and lead your business.
Very good. Well, Vanessa, great to meet you. Good work. I love what you're about.
Thank you. I feel like we could talk for another 3 hours, Dean.
I know, right? Didn't that just scream by?
The time has flown by, and thank you for sharing some of your insights as well. It was such
Absolutely. Well, have a great day and stay cool there up in Toronto.
Thanks so much. You too, Dean.
Okay.
Thank you for listening to The Business of Intuition. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to learn more about Dean or Mission Facilitators Leadership, go to mfileadership.com. That's mfileadership.com.